So I am being told that we are now live. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the e-roundtable, Whitehead and Nature, 100 Years On, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the first publication of the concept of nature by the English philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. This event is hosted by the Critical Humanities and International Politics Research Group based in the School of Humanities at University of Hertfordshire. For such a special occasion, I am delighted to be accompanied by a fine lineup of guest speakers. First of all, we have Luciana Parisi, Professor of Literature at Duke University. Good evening, Professor Parisi, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Good evening.
Second, we have Dr. Anna Richter, lecturer in politics and international relations, and also member of the Critical Humanities and International Politics Research Group. Welcome, Dr. Richter, and also thanks for being with us tonight. Next, we have Professor Stephen Shaviro, Professor of English at Wayne State University. Good evening, Professor Shaviro, and also thanks for participating at this roundtable. And last but not least, we have Keith Robinson, Professor of Philosophy based in University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Welcome, Professor Robinson, and thanks for being with us this evening as well. My name is Ignasi Torrent. I am also a lecturer in politics and international relations, and also a member of the Critical Humanities and International Politics Research Group. And I'll be moderating this round table. As very briefly as a mode of introduction, I shall warn the audience that the conversation will not solely be based on the concept of nature. Beyond this, we are going to take this opportunity to broaden the debate and discuss, if so, the way in which Whitehead's relational and process thinking can still be relevant to reflect upon nowadays world with its tensions, negotiations, violences, and glitches. We are going to organize this roundtable in 3 different blocks. In the first part, participants will individually elucidate in approximately 3 minutes their reading of the core ideas behind the concept of nature. Then we'll move on to the second and longest block of this roundtable, in which participants are going to engage in 3 different topics. And finally, we'll also have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A. We'll be hopefully concluding this roundtable in about 90 minutes, an hour and a half. Before we start, also very briefly, a bit of housekeeping. We'll be live tweeting using the hashtag WhiteheadNature100. You can actually see the details in the description box below the screen. We encourage the audience to participate and to ask the roundtable questions. We'll be collecting a few of those, and I will pass them on to the participants during the Q&A. Yeah. Without further ado, let's kick off with the first section of today. As I just explained, each participant will individually elaborate for about 3 minutes on the following question. Over the last years, in light of pressing ecological challenges, including global warming, pollution, the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, among others, the relation between human and nature is once again being reformulated. How would you argue that Whitehead's thought, and particularly in the concept of nature, can enable us to think human-nature relations in the present we live in? Shall we start with Professor Parisi?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I hope you don't mind. I'm not going to use the video, but I'm using the banner of Black Lives Matter today. So first of all, thank you for your invitation to have this conversation to celebrate Alfred North Whitehead book, Concept of Nature, 100 years later. I would like to say that, so thank you for putting this together and inviting me and put me in conversation with other people that I would like, I'm very grateful to speak to as well. So I would like to share, to say first of all that my intervention today is in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests that have spread in US, UK, and all over the world. And that I'm also participating, and I hope you can share that with me too, in the academic strike initiative that fellow physicist colleagues in US called the Particles for Justice movement have organized today. So in the organization of this strike today was also an invite to address questions of anti-Blackness and racism. And so my intervention and my contribution to this strike initiative is an invite to reflect upon what Whitehead concept of nature can do in this context, how it can contribute to challenge the socio-political formation predicated on an epistemology of nature that reflects an epistemology of race, and in particular, as Whitehead complains, the metaphysics of nature is explained away from what he calls the sense awareness of spatio-temporal experience, and is rather based on the bifurcations of nature, what he calls the bifurcation of nature between atoms and colors, and generally between concept of quantity and quality, which continue to justify the expropriation and the valorization of nature, which since the last century, scholars, activists, poets, artists, and musicians have been argued as extended upon Black lives. So the critique against these epistemologies of nature that Whitehead brings forward in this book, we know that are critiques that have been central to political theories of race, gender, and sexuality since the 20th century. And we know that the critical work of the late 20th century, for instance, deconstructivism, abstract materialism, speculative realism, has brought forward concepts of nature that refuse the bifurcation of nature. They refuse the scientific reliance and the philosophical reliance on eternal substantialism, objective materialism, and the Kantian self-determinist subject. I would like to point out that among this critique, the work of Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter importantly explains how the recursivity of these epistemologies, and thus the very acceptance about how to know and how to know what we know, has separated the object of nature from the complexity of spatio-temporality. So what would it mean, therefore, to discuss Whitehead's concept of nature and his critique of the metaphysics of nature rooted in substantialism and materialism in the light of epistemological critique of race, racialization of nature, or even naturalization of race today? So just to give a little bit of a background, for those of you who have been thinking about these things as well, we know that Michel Foucault's interventions on the genealogies of knowledge and the epistemological explanation of nature cannot be divorced from the epistemological formation of power, and therefore the critique of Western metaphysics that it has been argued has continued to operate under the vestiges of a secularization of Judeo-Christian metaphysics since the Enlightenment. Central to the critique of race and anti-Blackness is therefore a critique of the explanation of nature in terms of theories of evolution, speciation, racialization, and genderization that have constituted the basis of universal logic, the basis of the universal logic of value that has determined capital accumulation according to the measure of nature. And that is what is very important to me in this book that Whitehead brings forward, this question of measurement as a way to challenge the exceptionalism of man that has dominated the entire figuration of the human. So, in other words, what strikes me about what Whitehead concept of nature can do within this context of anti-racist politics, and is that is metaphysics, because it's of course is an attempt at rethinking metaphysics, starts from not an homogeneity of thinking nature, but precisely he argues for an heterogeneous thinking of nature. So Whitehead argued that as much as philosophy mistakes the bare entities of science as metaphysical substratum, so too scientists presuppose this substratum. And that's where the homogeneity in thinking nature stems from. So thinking with Whitehead in conjunction with the politics of nature, today I would like to reflect and invite my co-panelists to discuss about the problem of epistemology. That is, how do we know, and thus how do we measure what we know without predetermined nature according to a given system of value, which is embedded in a particular epistemology that recursively reduces the word to itself. So that's the question that I would like to pose. How do we think heterogeneity in nature, and how, starting from the question of heterogeneity of measurement, heterogeneity of thinking nature, we can rethink both at the kind of away from the homogenization of nature in terms of how it has produced a specific rationalization of the concept of nature. So yeah, I would like to leave my intervention like this and possibly add some more points on cosmotechnics, which is another point I wanted to raise later, so that I don't take too much time. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Parisi, for this ice-breaking intervention, and also for bringing some sense of topicality to this e-roundtable. I guess we cannot be isolated from the events that surround us. We'll continue with Dr. Richter. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I also would like to start with the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly with an image, which I decided not to share the screen because I don't particularly trust this platform now, and I think it will take longer than me just describing it because it's quite quick. Recently, I came across an image of a protester holding a sign, and I thought it would be a good way to illustrate what I want to say here. The sign said, everyone is ready for the world to end, but not for Black Lives Matter. And I think that is quite, as I said, quite a nice way to illustrate the way that ecology and the Anthropocene is thought about, and human, non-human relationships within it, within contemporary, particularly continental theory, and what might be some potential pitfalls here or some blind spots, and how we might be able to think beyond them with Whitehead. So, I mean, Luciana just touched upon this as well, but it is probably fair to say that social theory has rediscovered matter and materialism to a certain extent within the past decades, moving away from a certain focus on discursivity and language and culture to recognize that materiality, nature, has manifest effects on human societies, and to think about and respond to with Latour matters of concern that this produces. And what came with it was also a certain attempt to think beyond those modern figures of the subject as the sole actor within the world as the source of creativity and whatever the human subject produces. And to a certain extent, I think Whitehead, well, doesn't parallel, but preemptively go in the direction of this new materialist realist turn with a creativity that is fundamentally relational as well, with creative relations that are not entirely human, and the human element is not even prioritized here, is especially not prioritized in the concept of nature. But creative relations are, I mean, in later Whitehead, it's almost kind of an equal part of matter and what comes from non-sensory perception, and maybe the mind and abstraction, what is ultimately creative here. But it is, those creative relations are mixed. They go beyond the human. They are ecological in that sense. And so they overcome the Kantian dualism of mind and nature in that sense. And all of that is something that those new materialist realist theories want to do as well, I would say. But then on the other hand, I think that we find interesting points in Whitehead that might remind us to be a bit cautious or to be a bit nuanced with, I think, certain tendencies that we find in those newer theories. On the one hand, I think the focus on experience as that what, as the location of the production of the real is important, because experience, as in the concept of nature, it is predominantly temporally and spatially situated, but because it is situated, it is partial and it is particular, which means for the reality of the Anthropocene, of climate change, of ecological changes more generally, that it is also experienced in a way that is, particular to where the observer is standing. So it is not so much as we find sometimes in that literature that we are all in the same boat. We might be, but only to the extent that we are on the receiving end of the same material causes. But the experience that results from that is still manifestly different, to the extent, I would say, that it's not just multiple Anthropocenes, but that one reality that might be produced from that might have nothing to do with what we conventionally understand as living in the Anthropocene at all. What do I mean with that? For some, I don't know, maybe for a middle-class white citizen in a Western democracy, ecology might be a great new focus point for political action, and that's important. For someone else in an island state or in an indigenous community, ecological political activism might be a matter of survival. It might not be a choice, it might be a necessity. Whereas for someone else, it might just not be a priority, because the priorities lie with economic security or with fighting systemic racism. And so here, again, the reality that results from the same material causes is a fundamentally different one. And I think when we think about ecological politics today, then this is something important to keep in mind. Second point, there is, I think, because of this important and necessary attempt from materialist theories to overcome an anthropocentric thinking about agency, a tendency to prioritize material agency, and within ecological thinking, this, and here comes the poster back in, this leads to a certain tendency to say, well, we need to accept living in the end of times and reconceptualize politics as a result of that, maybe towards a more humble politics, a more resilient politics, instead of intentional governmental steering, thinking about adaptation and resilience to the natural forces, for which we are on the receiving end. And again, while I think this is very important, there might be, looking at the Black Lives Matter protest, there might be something to say about intentional steered activism, intentional action that is still necessary. Modern forms of governance, such as the state, the judicial system, from which justice is demanded, that might still have a role to play. And now with Whitehead, again, I think we can find an interesting nuanced common ground position where within his materialism, there is still a place for modern elements, both the abstractions of modern thought and what we can do with them in a maybe speculative, experimental way, transforming them rather than throwing them overboard. And on the other hand, there is a place for creative action, creative thinking on the human side as well, which is necessary to emphasize in combination with accepting that we are living in the end of times. Because if not, then I think there is a danger that this has a certain depoliticizing flavor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richter. We'll continue with Professor Shaviro.
Okay, so what I have to say is probably more narrowly focused on what Whitehead actually wrote than on the applications, because I think there's a lot there. In the concept of nature, the part that's really important to me is the second chapter, which is where he defines what he's opposed to, which he calls the bifurcation of nature. and that this, to him, is a source of the problems he wants to address, particularly in that book. Later on, he goes to more general considerations about the world, but it kind of starts here with the bifurcation of nature. So the bifurcation of nature, I think, is something which still largely exists today. Whitehead defines it as sort of the contrast between, say, phenomenological experience on the one hand and scientific abstraction on the other hand. The point is not to choose either of those, but that we have to be able to have a frame of reference where we talk about both. So, I mean, he talks about the red sunset and the scientific account of photons shooting from the sun, and he says we need a way to talk which considers both of these to be true, rather than either a scientific abstraction which basically dismisses the subjective experience as irrelevant or meaningless or just as an epiphenomenal result of scientific causes, but also a phenomenological approach which would claim that the relation of subject to object or subjective synthesis of experience comes first and everything else is secondary to that. So I think Whitehead is opposed to both sides. I mean, it's sort of like, if you look today, you see on the one hand people who talk about phenomenology, on the other hand people who say, well, we know how the mind works because of neurons and blah, 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 and therefore subjective experience is merely deceptive. And Whitehead's opposed to both of these, or thinks they're both reductive. What this has to do in general, I think, is his theories of abstractions. Abstractions are always simplifications. They take away, they don't go to the full measure of reality of what is. And the problem is, on the one hand, we cannot ever do without abstractions. It's impossible. There's just too much going on that without abstractions we can't focus anything in any way. But at the same time, we must be aware of our abstractions because we take them to be more than they are. So we take them to be the whole of reality when they're in fact they're abstractions from reality. And so I think Whitehead's asking us to move back and forth in this case. So in a certain sense, Whitehead's often seen as a critique of science, and I think that's partly true, but he also very much wants to rescue science from its own blind spots. And in a way, he's anti-skeptical because he insists that the abstractions that science discovers are real. They're real as abstractions. They're not the totality of everything, but they shouldn't be dismissed. Neither should our subjective impressions be dismissed, but we shouldn't take everything back to the fundamental ground of subjectivity. So in the concept of nature, he says he's not doing metaphysics, which he does explicitly do in some of his later works. But he says nature as experience is a kind of flow of events. So we understand space and time, and they're real, but they're abstractions from events. We understand our own subjective emotions, but these are also abstractions from events. Rather than having a subject opposing an object world and cognizing it in some way, we have events which include things that are happening in different parts of the world. And my understanding is just another event. So right now I'm looking at a computer screen. What's happening on the computer screens are events which are mediated in various ways from various other locations. My perceiving this, though, is also an event on the same level with all these other events. So for me, the important thing about Whitehead coming from this is precisely to try to look at these levels of abstraction. In terms of politics, since it's been raised by the previous speakers, I don't find Whitehead that useful for directly political considerations. I don't think he's incompatible with things which come from elsewhere, but things always do come from elsewhere. I mean, Whitehead, if you look at his own politics, he says towards the end of his life that he's slightly left of center. So he's not a kind of reactionary bigot, but he's not particularly progressive or particularly aware of economic disparities or racism either. But I think the general way he asks us to look at our abstractions, to be aware of our level of abstractions, to understand we cannot bifurcate between what's merely subjective and what's supposedly objective, but that we have to take these in the same sense, at the same level, is an important starting point for thinking about all these other things, which for me also include stuff you get from elsewhere. Okay, that's what I have for now for starting student.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaviro. Professor Robinson, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Ignasi, and for organisers for setting up this great event. It's good to be here. In general, I think we can say that Whitehead provides a kind of critical diagnosis of, let's just say, modernity. So philosophy is to be the critic of abstractions. And I think he also provides a set of concepts that attempt to give us something like new imaginary, perhaps a kind of imageless imaginary. We'll come back to that. But very quickly, the key concepts for me relate to what I'll call the idea of constitutive temporality, or a new logic of becoming. So with this new logic of temporality or becoming, it calls into question anthropocentrism, human sovereignty, human exceptionalism, and distinctions between human and nature. Indeed, maybe all sort of in itself. So I think many of Whitehead's concepts seem to work in this way, as kind of requiring each other, being dependent upon each other, and so on. So, for example, creativity is never simply affirmative, I don't think, in Whitehead, despite what some of the critics say about the philosophers of creativity, Whitehead, Bergson, and maybe Deleuze as well. Creativity for Whitehead and those other thinkers is never simply affirmative. It involves destruction, it involves transition, it involves decay and loss, as Whitehead says. Or take, for example, the notion of peace. In Whitehead, peace is only ever understood in relation to tragedy. It seems as though a lot of his concepts work in this way. The way this gets worked out, I think, in the concept of nature, is that Whitehead introduces the famous critical diagnostic concept of the bifurcation of nature, which is essentially the idea of two systems, two realities, if you like. One system of nature which is apprehended in awareness, and another system that's the cause of awareness. So the bifurcation is between what Whitehead calls famously the conjecture and the dream. Right, the greenness of the grass is apprehended in my awareness, but the electrons are the cause of that awareness. So the greenness is regarded from the point of view of bifurcation, from the point of view of scientific mechanism and materialism, as this kind of psychic addition or secondary quality. And on this view, it's supposedly not part of reality. It's just a dream, right? Whereas the electrons are supposedly real. The really real thing, they're the primary quality. Now, I think we can suggest that there's a correlation between the bifurcation of nature and the phenomena that Ignasi that came up in the question: climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, and so on. Now, there's a correlation here because if nature is regarded as meaningless bits of matter, then we can treat it instrumentally. Bound up, though, with the bifurcation of nature, underlying it or grounding it is a complete scientific picture of the natural world with concepts of space, time, and matter that have almost become kind of second nature. It's part of our imaginary, part of our common sense. If we translate that or transpose that scientific mechanistic view of the world into contemporary forms of capitalism, neoliberalism, then I think all kinds of nasties are going to come out, kind that we've already been discussing. Whitehead's proposal, I think, in the concept of nature is to challenge the bifurcation of nature by providing a kind of speculative concept of nature, a sort of an alternative imaginary or picture of space, time, and matter. The key concept is the event. The event, he says, is a passage of nature. It's an overlapping of extensions, as he says. Objects are co-gradient in events, and this becomes later on in process and reality the actual occasions in external objects that we're all familiar with. So events or actual occasions, let's say, have both physical and mental poles. And so just with that idea in itself, I think it helps us to develop or think about and open up new ways of talking and thinking that break down the human nature distinction and all of its various correlates. I think the characteristic of the event or actual occasions is that it offers a kind of constitutive temporality that I've already mentioned that's presupposed by all experience. So this temporality is famously in Whitehead one of becoming and perishing. Nothing ever really is, it only ever becomes. And this constitutive temporality opens up a system, a possible system of transformation, a possible space of transformation. New ways of thinking and talking about reality, maybe new ways to open up then politics and ethics and think and talk about them in new ways. I don't think Whitehead provides, and I'm kind of in some agreement here with Stephen, I don't think he provides any principles as such, in my opinion, for specific acts of interpretation politically, specific acts of intervention politically or ethically. But he gives a new set of presuppositions or a new framework. I mean, that's primarily what I wanted to say. I did want to pose a question as well, just very quickly. One of the questions that I think is really interesting is why these bifurcations keep coming back. So the bifurcation of nature and the way Whitehead describes it is really specific, I think, to modernity. There are all kinds of bifurcations operating, and that have operated throughout history. You can go all the way back to the Greeks, being and becoming, appearance and reality, and so on. Why are these, even if we can show that they're incompatible with each other, the oppositions involved, if we can show that they're incompatible, if we can show that they don't reflect our experience, why are they so tenacious? Why are they so resistant? Why do we still have them embedded in our systems of thinking?
Thank you. Thanks the four of you for these thoughtful, ice-breaking interventions. I'm glad to see that Whitehead's philosophy is still relevant nowadays to reflect upon contemporary human nature relations. We are now going to move on to the second and longest block of this roundtable, in which participants are going to engage in conversation around three different topics. The first question, and obviously I'll touch on some of the issues that have already been discussed, yeah? Mm-hmm. While Whitehead does not present his philosophy in opposition to positivist science, he does reveal how science comes with its own speculative underpinnings, and that in modern empiricism, the subject-object or the observer-observed tension is insufficiently resolved. Whitehead reminds us that knowledge production is always experimental and situated, and that we cannot subordinate things themselves to our experience of them. To what extent is this reflexive exercise necessary in the face of current challenges such as COVID-19, where political responses rely heavily on scientific insights? Or from a different angle, to what extent this reflexive exercise could fuel the arguments of right-wing populists, climate change deniers, or vaccines skeptics? The floor is open.
I'll just make one point, which is that I don't think Whitehead's arguments about the limits of science are compatible with the kind of skepticism that you mentioned that is being weaponized right now. And that's because he doesn't make something, but he doesn't allow for skepticism. That's part of his critique of Hume. If all I have, according to Hume, are these separate impressions in my mind, how do I know that it corresponds to anything out there? Now that may be a metaphysical argument, but it also becomes a kind of general mood. Somebody like Stanley Cavell, late 20th century, wrote about how this temptation to skepticism seems to be a part of modernity. Mm-hmm. But Whitehead is telling us basically that we can't divide the world between stuff going on in our minds and stuff going on elsewhere. so that you can't be skeptical of the lack of correspondence between stuff going on in my mind and stuff going on outside. I mean, precisely because of the sense that that's a bifurcation which is misleading us, and because of this is relational philosophy in general, things are related to other things. So, I mean, the point is that in terms of the leverage you have, the kind of skepticism that says, I don't believe what these doctors are saying, is not what he's talking about at all. He is talking about perhaps philosophers who say that obviously consciousness doesn't really exist and we're just deluded to think that it does. But that's a very different kind of target. So in a certain sense, I think Whitehead is anti-skeptical because he's insisting that, as opposed to, especially in the United States of America, this kind of individualism that I decide everything and I'm separate from everybody else, which is so much a center of American ideology and which has played its part, not in the last couple of weeks, but earlier in the epidemic when people were protesting, saying they wanted to go to their hairdresser or whatever, and how dare the government try to stop them. The idea that Whitehead doesn't make it possible to think that you're totally isolated and autonomous from everything else, and everything else is just things that are secondarily reflect. So in that sense, I don't see, I mean, relativism is a bad word to use because it has so many different meanings. And so that's why I tend to be dubious of critiques of we need absolute truth, we can't have this relativism, because that's a false dichotomy. It's another form of bifurcation. Whitehead's asking us to think about how anything, let's say, I think I'm doing as an autonomous subject is in fact very relational and very intricated with all these other things going on. And that doesn't give us an answer, but as a starting point, it forces us to think about things in a different way.
Thanks, Theo. If I may come in, I totally agree that the question of the limits of nature as the limits of thought is something that Whitehead talks a lot about, and in a way, is one could argue that he dares to say that against Kant, that one needs to rethink of the limits of nature as the limits of thought, and so. The fact that the idea of measuring, what does it mean to measure our relationship with nature? What does it mean to measure the real? Is speculative in it. Must be speculative in itself, because there is a level in which, even if there is more that we see in nature, there is more in nature that we see, there is more in nature that we can conceive. Nonetheless, the kind of speculative work the science can do can allow for the limits of nature, the limits of thought to enter or challenge the homogeneity, or challenge those kind of presupposition on nature that we have. And so I would like to just make another point about the idea of the immunitas, in terms of how the COVID-19, the idea that also, as we've been seeing in the banners of protesters in the last few days, racism is a pandemic, and as Anna said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of racism. That reminds me of course of Mark Fisher idea of speculative capitalism, as if it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism than actually some kind of the future. So the end of future than the end of capitalism. So this kind of relation between science as in grasping or articulating the real, and as opposed to some kind of dogmatic belief in philosophical belief of what is the real, is very important, to the extent that it points at the fallacy of what Whitehead calls misplaced concreteness, where there's this understanding of the human or knowledge, or a kind of system, epistemological system, as being immune. The idea that the virus shows that there is a limit to the immunity of the sovereign subject. There's a limit to the immunity of knowledge, and demands for other forms of experimental knowledge that are also experimental living, because in a way, even if what the virus has done is to challenge the idea of a germinal purity, or to propose what kind of germ, what kind of family of germ you want to become participant with, right? And forces us to really rethink the idea of immunology, or the immunology of knowledge, or the immunology of the human, in very interesting way, and in relation to, of course, the unknown, and we know that the racialization of nature, the racialization of gender has placed this figure of the unknown, and therefore becoming immune from the unknown. So it opens a very interesting anti-skeptical, proposition.
Yeah, I would say that Whitehead's analysis of science seems to be very different from the so-called arguments of climate change deniers, for example, which seems to be what the question is getting at. Whitehead's analysis of science seems very different. I mean, his analysis shows that classical science is bifurcated, as we've suggested. And as it's phrased in the question, perhaps we can say that the abstractions it produces reflect the position of observation, just as much as they reflect the object of scientific analysis. The reflexive exercise there, as the question puts it, I guess we could say is in some sense sort of necessary at the level of, say, the individual and the objects of everyday life. That is the recognition that some of our abstractions reflect that position. But outside of this, outside of what we can call common sense or classical science, Whitehead's trying to revise our fundamental notions. So for process philosophy and for Whitehead, I think our inherited modes of thought are inadequate for dealing with the new data furnished by, say, for example, 20th century science, relativity and quantum. So new modes of thought are going to be required here. And this is in part what I think his speculative constructions offer. So on the one hand, Whitehead shows us that classical science falls foul, if you like, of various fallacies: the fallacy of simple location, subject quality metaphysics, substance quality metaphysics, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, and so on. And on the other hand, he's producing speculative constructions to sort of contest those or overcome them. But I suspect that the question is really about the connection between, the idea that the science is uncertain, or there's always plausible deniability, or something along these lines. And I think the response there is to simply strategically use or refer to, bifurcated, if you like, or simply located notions of agency and responsibility, and to hold the climate change deniers responsible. Right? So.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly, I have nothing to add on the climate change deniers front, because I think everything has been said. Whitehead's skepticism of science or view of science is very different from that, and in a sense, his opposition to the bifurcation of nature would exactly be in opposition to those views. But maybe on what Whitehead can tell us about the event about the pandemic is that it is precisely not. There is a bit of an obsession with looking for a singular cause or something to blame, which is maybe China hasn't informed the international community quickly enough, or everything was great, but then the virus arrived and we just have to eradicate the virus and then it's fine again. And that it is exactly not that. There is no singular identifiable cause to what has happened. But the pandemic is a multiplicity, the result of a multiplicity of interacting events. It is, of course, there is the virus. Of course, there are international players, but there are also existing economic inequalities, structures of gendered, racialized injustice that this is interacting with, and this is just as well also producing the pandemic as it is experienced, and that might be something to draw from this as well.
Let me just pick up on this comment, maybe to move on to the second question, which is obviously related to this one. So Whitehead's process philosophy replaces a stable and essentialized form of being with an ongoing relational becoming made up of what he calls events. And linked to the previous question, relationally produced and situated knowledge seems to have the potential to foster emergent ruptures between the discursive materialist binary or the constructivist realist binary. Do you think that Whitehead's process philosophy offers an alternative or even a way out of this stalemate? Does Whitehead's relational ontology allow recognizing the shaping power of varied phenomena such as natural disasters or the outcomes of neuroscientific progress such as artificial intelligence, or even the function of art in the world beyond this traditional ontological divide, if you want? Anyone wants to tackle this question?
I guess I'll begin again. I don't know
Good.
if nobody else is
Good.
going to. I'm willing to make a fool of myself. But okay, so I mean, it's like I do think that Whitehead provides a different kind of illumination on a lot of these intellectual disputes of the last 50 years. And I mean, one is in terms of when he asks us to think of nature, the passive nature, and that there's more in it than we get at first glance. It's sort of like, it seems false, for instance, to say is something real or is something artificial or something natural or is it socially constructed? Because I think from a Whiteheadian perspective, everything's constructed, but that's what nature is the process of construction and also destruction, but both. But I mean, it's sort of like, even things even social items like, the philosopher Ian Hacking wrote a book about social constructions where he said, what does it mean? Nobody makes an argument about whether a bridge is socially constructed, because obviously people went out and dug and did it and everything like that. But I mean, part of the point is people made up the bridge, but the bridge is made of materials which are gotten out of the ground and processed in various ways. It has to obey certain constraints of how gravity works and things like that. And part of, I think, a more Whiteheadian way to think of this would be to say that we have all these experiential activities which are constructing, but it's not just that society on one hand constructs versus something else that is given. I mean, the same thing's obvious when you think about things about gender and sexuality, where you sort of have evolutionary psychologists claiming that human nature was absolutely fixed in the Pleistocene era and this is unchangeable, but in fact, and therefore they attack the idea that, say, gender is a social construction. But in fact, if you actually look at how different human cultures work, it's much that actually gender, sexuality things are in natural terms or in biological terms much more fluid than we think. And society is often social constraints over what stabilize it. I mean, if you think about sexuality, gender, you're thinking about all kinds of things, including people's chromosomes, including the hormones going in their bodies, including different ways they've been taught how to act and behave through social processes. All these things do not necessarily align with each other. So one thing Whitehead sort of, I think, tells us there is that both sides of duality between something is really natural, that's the way things have to be, versus something being just an arbitrary or social construction, that both sides of that are wrong. So, I mean, I think, it obviously applies when conservatives say that, well, I mean, there's been this big dispute in the Twitter sphere this last 3 days because J.K. Rowling once again went on a rampage and said that men are men and women are women. This is a biological fact. You can't. And so therefore she's sort of supporting discrimination against trans people. And I mean, that's awful. But the point is that it has nothing to do with nature in the sense that Rowling is saying. I mean, these things are not always given. They're so variable. If you think of psychological factors, genetic factors, hormonal factors, different kinds of physical experience, different kinds of social experience, psychological experience. I mean, it's the very start of a position that the body is real as opposed to all these other artificial things is a fallacy from the beginning. And I think Whitehead helps us see a lot of things along these lines. So that's one factor, at least.
Thank you, Stephen. So I just followed the orders before.
Go ahead.
Yes. So I wanted to just mention that how this, of course, this question of the binary and the bifurcation is very much about, a particular epistemological formation that one has to recognize at this. To go through this passage of a Western metaphysics into a secularization of Western metaphysics with modern science. And so there is some kind of formation of an epistemology that becomes universal and that also is espoused by a universal question of technology. So I wanted to just point to the fact that the debate between essentialism and constructivism is part of this recursive epistemology that maintains a specific relation with specific knowledges that come from theories of evolution, physics, or even go up to the level of artificial intelligence, where you still continue to see the same discussion of biases, the same discussion of reproduction of femininity, of racialization, as if we're one model, one universal model. And I guess what, to me at least, that's what I was reflecting upon the last few days, and other times with other colleagues, is how the concept of nature instead opens up to this heterogeneity of thinking, heterogeneous thinking in nature, and it keeps on saying that in this quite early book, much earlier book than of course Intervention, than Process Philosophy, where he unpacks his metaphysics more clearly. And I was thinking at how that allows not for a universal model of science and technology, but from what people have been, especially in the work of Yokoi, have talked in terms of cosmotechnics. So what does the cosmotechnical approach is an approach that wants to argues against the bifurcation of nature, or the social constructivist essentialist models as the universal Western model that is imported, exported, that has colonized other forms of, instead, phenomenological, cultural, historical relation with nature, which are, can instead be thought in terms of cosmotechnics. And what would it mean for this, articulating a relation between nature and myth, a cultural relation between nature and myth that does not go through the bifurcation of nature. I mean, the effort of Whitehead is not just critical, but is in constructing a system, a system where there is a possibility of not only challenging the universal model of science, but also opening up science to its own limit, to open up different modes of thought. In fact, in the book Modes of Thought, it's another, or Adventures of Ideas, of Science in the Modern World. There we find a lot of inspiration as to how that could be or can contribute to this effort of trying to move away from one universal model of technology and science, the colonial one that we still inherited today.
I think the answer to the question is yes. I mean, as we've seen, Whitehead's metaphysics tries to overcome the bifurcations here. I mean, I think he definitely, if we talk about the idea, for example, of a kind of ontological constructivism, that seems to me to be what Whitehead's doing here. Is sort of everything is placed on the same ground. It's kind of monism that opens up into a pluralism. I think this is a sort of inversion of Kant's philosophy, where the subject emerges from the world. So, yeah, I think that phrase, ontological constructivism, is one that I think is apposite for Whitehead here in terms of these various kinds of debates going on in continental theory.
Yeah, I mean, I touched upon this in my opening pitch a little bit. I guess the interesting thing for me, thinking about Whitehead in the context of contemporary continental philosophy, is that Whitehead makes it possible to think the emergence of the new without the necessity to locate it in either an epistemological realm or a sort of material realm, but thinking as genuinely immanent, relationally immanent in a sense, which I think, as I said, I think gets rid of a bunch of problems, both the sort of Western modern tendency. If we only look at epistemology, then we are prioritizing a sort of cultural realm which we pretend is universal, but which might not be universal at all. But if we locate creative potential predominantly in the material realm, then there might be a certain political passivity following from that, but also we might reify something in nature which actually isn't really to be found in nature, but also reflects our position of looking at nature, such as sexual difference, for example. If we identify this as a kind of creative element in nature, then is it really a binary that runs through? Is it really necessary? And I think the kind of the interaction, the relational interaction of events, and thinking that as what produces the new in Whitehead is both allows for a slightly more optimistic thinking about what that things can actually change than in much else, of like biopolitical continental philosophy, for example, but without the pitfalls of both kind of a strong materialist or a strong kind of discursive position. And I think that is quite a promising perspective.
Mm-hmm. And beyond these philosophical underpinnings, we think that an important aspect of the current rediscovery of Whitehead lies in the fact that it spans and interlinks several varied disciplines, from science and technology studies to environmental humanities, media studies, international relations, and even architecture, literature, or design. And so how do you explain Whitehead's wide and current appeal? And then which leaps of imagination has his thought allowed you to make in your own work? And how do you hope for others to think through Whitehead in the future?
Am I supposed to start again? Since that seems to be
It's up to the floor.
Yes, Stu, you are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is that I think Whitehead's become better known because of other people who referred to him. In continental philosophy, most obviously Isabel Stengers, and behind her Deleuze. And because they took Whitehead seriously, other people have. I mean, I started reading Whitehead because I read Stengers, and Stengers wrote a 600-page book about Whitehead. So I had to read Whitehead to understand what Stengers was saying about Whitehead. But it has to do, I think, partly with that, partly with just, it's sort of like a sense that, I mean, the two of the important things I find in Whitehead's philosophy, just to think with, or starting points for thinking about, are one is, if everything's processed and everything's relational, then instead of assuming that things are solid and then we worry about how they fall apart, we have to take for granted that things are always in process, always changing. As he says in The Concept of Nature, the Cleopatra's Needle in London it looks like it's the same, but on a microscopic level, it's always changing. It gets dirt on it, the dirt gets cleaned off, it gets rained on, birds poop on it, all this kind of stuff. So to understand one thing is that permanence, or relative permanence, is an accomplishment rather than what's given as the way things are to start with. What's given the way things are to start with is a passage of nature or events. So that's a kind of inversion. It doesn't mean that everything disappears and that nothing nothing remains. But to understand, I mean, this also relates to biological themes, questions about life, because it's obviously living things try to preserve themselves over time, and they engage in all kinds of processes to do this. But again, no living thing lasts as long as a rock does. It takes much longer for the rock to be eroded away than for living things to go through their life cycle and die. But nonetheless, keeping a structure intact and making it able to react and move and be flexible and yet not be completely destroyed by changes is an accomplishment. And by starting with process and relation, Whitehead helps us think about this. The other thing, I think, the other important thing for me is futurity. I mean, the fact that Whitehead insists on a kind of open futurity, which is something that, I mean, a lot of scientific materialists sort of think everything's deterministic, even though science itself on the quantum level says that's not true. But, you know, understanding that futures are open. I mean, you know, I get very depressed politically because things are so awful, despite the signs of resistance the last few weeks. You know, living under Donald Trump is no picnic. But, you know, things can and do and will change. Futurity, there are various is filled with potentiality. It's not just something predetermined. There's more to, I mean, another thing to say is that, that for Whitehead, there's more to the real than the actual. So this is a thing which links up with Gilles Deleuze. So Deleuze has this quote from Proust that what Deleuze calls the virtual is real but not actual. I don't think Whitehead read Proust, but nonetheless he comes up with a similar formula. He says the future is what's real but not actual. There are more factors than what is currently manifested. And that means that it can't just, not anything can happen, but what happens is not predetermined either. And obviously this has great political weight today when on the one hand, I mean, Luciana referred to Mark Fisher, his ideas about capitalist realism, that we have these apocalyptic imaginings because the only way we can imagine getting out of capitalism is if everything's destroyed. I mean, that's, you know, unless the entire world's destroyed, I'll still have to pay my Visa bill every month, basically. Whitehead allows us to think that there are other futures possible, that it doesn't have to be either everything collapses in destruction or else we're preordained the same way. And we live in a society where, you know, financialization, which is increasingly a factor in our lives, is precisely a thing to make bets on the futures that no matter what happens, the same people make profits. In other words, it's to prevent the future from financialization is the way we imagine the future, but it's also the way to prevent the future from actually being different. So Whitehead's sense of an open futurity allows some kind of pushback against that. So those two things, the sense of permanence as an achievement and a relative one, and of futurity as being open, are to me right now the most important things I get from Whitehead.
Thank you, Stephen. Always great to hear your comments on why this is important to your work. I just would like to add that I came to Whitehead because I needed to rethink the discrete and the critique of discreteness, as most of my work is interested in or is focused on how to rethink technology. That's how the kind of on one end poetics and on the other hand techne or mechanicism. So how you think of technology outside this tradition of let's say a correlation between vitalism and mechanicism, and Whitehead, especially in the second part of Process and Reality and his discussion on the extensive continuum or meritopology, allowed me to formulate what would it be to think of algorithms that have been always determined or defined in terms of finite sets of procedure, in terms instead of process. What would it mean? What would it mean also to allow for an understanding of the medium or tools and machine, not in terms of just sheer instrumentality, but in terms of other forms of intelligence that have been repressed or somehow just defined as servile within the history of Western thought. And so the idea of discreteness with the Whitehead became open to this kind of relation between parts and parts, relation between wholes and parts, and also the idea of a spacious present, whereby the relation between algorithms would actually allow for the constitution of a nexus of data that was not necessarily predetermined by or sterile within the machine. So at a bigger level allowed me to rethink of digitality away from this distinct opposition between analog and discrete, or continuous and discrete, and the idea of how can you start thinking about becoming and continuity together, or instead of a kind of flawless continuity or a flawless experience of time that I found in the work like Stephen, indebted by to Deleuze, and Deleuze reading of Bergson, and Deleuze reading of Whitehead in the fold. Then it became this kind of opportunity to reevaluate technoscience for me. So that's where and to rethink and think of speculative of speculation, or rethink about possibility of thought away from the kind of condemnation of technoscience as just being on tech, which basically is derived from the work and the critique of Heidegger. So that was one way for me to as to why Whitehead has been important to develop this idea of discreteness in process, as it were, within technology studies, or philosophy of technology or critical technology. On the other hand, the idea of displacement, whereby spatio-temporality for Whitehead is as being a nexus never allows for being exactly in the same moment, in a precise, although it's precise, but not in a kind of predetermined moment. And so the displacement of spatio-temporality as a way to think of a way to escape from the determination of space and time. And this I'm very sympathetic and indebted also to the work of Stephen in terms of thinking about Whitehead talks about how the future knows into the present, eats into the present, and allow for a way of experiencing spatio-temporality, not just in terms of a phenomenological, from a phenomenological point of view, but from this kind of abstract forms, or this kind of weird forms that allow for a fugitivity from what you are, right? From a determination of history from the past. So the inheritance of the past is being challenged every moment in this discreteness that allows for a knowing of the future that constitutes your present. And that's a political perspective that I share with feminists, with Black studies, and critique of race and so on, that I think is very important to get out of this kind of universal epistemology of science. So yeah, that was for me.
Professor Robinson or Dr. Richter, either?
I think, shall I break the order?
Yep, go for it.
So actually, what I was thinking was very close to what Stephen already said. So maybe I don't have that much to add. But I was thinking, because of Whitehead's example of permanence, the Cleopatra's Needle on the embankment and the pyramid. More topically, I was thinking of another permanent, no longer permanent thing, which is Edward Forstman's statue in Bristol. That was torn down. So this idea that that permanence is an accomplishment as well. One could give it an optimistic spin and say, well, that means that the permanence of the things that we might not like might be might be more fragile because it has to be accomplished as well. So it takes generations of people walking past this statue and not thinking anything about it to keep it there. But if that is no longer the case, then the statue is no longer there, and the event of tearing down the statue now might inspire others. So yeah, in that sense, I share sort of slightly optimistic spirit that I think one can draw from Whitehead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to say here. I don't think we have time to go through all of it, but I think the rediscovery of Whitehead is the effect of numerous transformations and leaps across all kinds of disciplines and borders. I would place Whitehead in a group of 20th century, amongst a group of 20th century continental philosophers, not just process philosophers, who have questioned anthropocentrism and human sovereignty. Group I think I would include would be Foucault, who's already been mentioned. Foucault's historical a priori, and of course his anti-humanism. Remember the image of the man's face in the sand about to be erased by the oncoming tide. Derrida's deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence. I think Whitehead is strikingly close to some of these kinds of ideas. What was that term in Derrida? Phallogocentrism. What a wonderful kind of a wonderful construction. We need more words like this. Of course, Deleuze is transcendental empiricism, and the idea that the human is caught up with and conditioned by all kinds of reactive forces. But specifically, I think Deleuze's interest in Whitehead has played a huge part in his revival, and Stephen's already mentioned Stenger's work as well. And there's a whole bunch of different groups and people around this. I think. But just placing Whitehead within that company 20 years ago, nobody would have done that. Mm-hmm. So I think more generally, I think Whitehead's appeal is part of a wider set of concerns that we can capture with I'll call it the process turn. So much work in the humanities and in the sciences is now concerned with process ideas, even if they're reluctant to talk about Whitehead, and some of them are. So, for example, we could mention Joanna Seib's work on developing a general process ontology. There's all kinds of other work going on in analytic philosophy, perhaps surprisingly. There's John Dupre's work, amongst many others, in trying to work out a process ontology for biology. I've already mentioned in continental philosophy the role of certain 20th century French thinkers. In contemporary terms, the speculative realism, we don't think we've mentioned them yet. Maybe Stephen did. New materialism, which draw on process ideas and themes. So although the process turn is still only kind of partial and provisional and sort of incomplete, I hope that going forward, Whitehead and process thought could inspire a more generalized process turn across the sciences and the humanities. And it's been said that, quote, every science has progressed beyond an initial conception of its phenomena in substance terms to an understanding that they are in fact process phenomena. Now, whether that's true or not, I think it's something we might hope for in the future. I mean, what would a generalized process term look like in every discipline? I mean, sometimes I think about this. If you think about all the simply located substantial concepts that are operating in every discipline that we have in the academy, what would that look like? And this, I think, is the value, of course, of interdisciplinary thinking as well. But what new modes of thinking and talking and so on could such a generalized process turn encourage? I guess that's what I take away from from Whitehead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We've collected a couple of questions from the audience that are hopefully going to pop up on the screen. Yes, thank you. We have about 12, 13 minutes to discuss those. So I'm just going to read this first one aloud. So given the resurgence of interest in panpsychism among analytic philosophers, why is it that Whitehead's unique process relational version has been largely ignored in favor of Russellian monism?
I'm not sure there's any more complicated answer to that than that. Analytic philosophers read Russell, I don't read Whitehead. I'm not sure that it's more complicated than that. I mean, I find that some of the people interested in panpsychism, like Galen Strawson, are developing metaphysics, which seems much more similar to Whitehead than he probably realizes, because I don't know if he's read Whitehead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know.
Fair enough. Any other reaction to that, or?
Yeah, I think Steven's right. I think analytic philosophers, just for the most part, I mean, the ones I've mentioned will not talk very much about Whitehead.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks who work in process philosophy, in analytic philosophy, refuse to talk about Whitehead, and it's for the usual kinds of reasons that you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there's a lack of clarity, all these sorts of questions about clarity and rigor and what he's doing metaphysically. Of course, there's the theology, the process theology bit. So even though panpsychism might be regarded by many analytic philosophers as a bit out there, you know, reading Whitehead as well is just a step too far.
Mm-hmm. Good. Professor Parisi or Dr. Richter, anything to add to that?
No comments on this.
No?
No, I think that
should
we have.
Should we move to the
you.
second question then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the second question: do any of you find inspiration in concrete projects that cut across the art/science binary to address pressing issues, for example, climate change, racial justice, etc.? What projects? Can they be upscaled?
Upscaled meaning, what does it mean, upscaled? Sorry. Just
native
scaled over, like put them,
Native speakers?
And native speakers.
Upscale just means...
I mean, there's quite a lot. I mean, there is, I don't know if they know the work of Denise Ferreira da Silva and Arinjana Newman, Four Waters. That's one I think that definitely addresses these questions. It's called Four Waters. I don't know if other people know. There is Jenna Sutela Holibjond, who is a Finnish artist. I'm not sure. I think that there is quite a few actually. If people want to be referred to. Actually, something that I'll be not part of, but it's a piece that is part of this kind of conference, online visual art exhibition that is called Contagion. From the 15th of June to 24th of July, there's quite a lot of interesting people. Much more interesting than I could ever be, or you know, in terms of using art, a visual art or performing art or music even, that are discussing these kind of issues.
Mm-hmm. Anyone want to react to that as well?
I would just second what Luciana is saying, just that there is a lot of interesting bio art and environmental art. And this has been going on for 50 or 60 years, but it's especially become more prevalent in recent years. But I'm not sure how that is upscaled. I mean, some of this art intends to be activist, but it's still hard to know how that would relate to, say, supporting the Sioux Nation against the pipelines which they're trying to push through their land. I mean, I don't know how to link all those things together.
We have a third question. In relation to this attempt to think the actuality of A and F for thinking contemporary politics, I was thinking if the idea of indifference can at all be interesting to take into account.
Neither. It's interesting. I do know Nida. Hi. If I may, this idea of indifference, it was, it's definitely a work that I would say would be more related to Alain Badiou. I think efforts to think of politics of another kind. There was also a book, I don't remember, on queer critique, which claimed the idea of indifference, because of course the question of indifference to representation or to politics of representation, and also to politics of difference, of philosophy of difference, that somehow it has been argued that also have fallen into the problem of representation, or the question of intersectionality that problematically brings back again, one could argue, the bifurcation of nature. So I don't think that Whitehead allows just directly for indifference in the same terms of this kind of critique.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Or in relation to anything else we've discussed? No words from the participants? Otherwise, please go ahead, Professor Shaviro.
I just said I'm not sure what's meant by indifference in the last question. So.
Yeah. Do we have? Yes, we have one more question. Keith, can we henceforth quote you on the process turn? I love it, of course.
Hi, Adrian. You can definitely quote me on that, yeah.
We didn't touch on, but there is, of course, a whole bunch of literature against relations. Yeah, like Graham Harman would call a relation just a short-lived object. Claire Colebrook is also against this relational turn, if you will. I mean, we didn't touch on that, but of course there is a debate ongoing here, right? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's, I wouldn't want to say relations good, substance bad, in the sense that, I mean, relations, a lot of horrible things can happen because of relations you can't escape from. Think of somebody, family member who's totally obnoxious but you can't get away from.
That's why I guess for Whitehead, it's not just a question of continuous seamless relation. It's situated, it's a nexus of event. It's got all a complexity of agency that requires a complexity of collective critique. So it's not a passepartout for everything. To the opposite, it requires a lot of unpacking, debunking, reconstructing. So I would be careful about this kind of seemingly critical relation, as if there was everything is connected to something else without accountability. Because I don't think that Whitehead neglects accountability. It's the opposite.
Well, there is a debate, as you know. You could kind of situate it in relation to Bergson and Whitehead, and I've written a little bit about this. It relates to this phrase, continuity is becoming a continuity. I think that's an interesting debate to sort of pick up on, which underlying it are all these issues relating to relationality. And the question of atomicity, I think, in certainly in process and reality, I mean, that would be one distinction I would make between the concept of nature and process and reality, is that the concept of nature seems to me to be a very relational book, right? I mean, it's about the continuity of events overlapping and extending over each other in a way that it seems to me is constrained in process and reality. You have the introduction of, I think, a kind of Jamesian influence notion of the atomic or the species present, where there is a becoming, and then the becoming perishes and ends, and there's a kind of sealed up atomic structure there, if you like. And this opens up onto big kind of sort of readings of Whitehead and the tradition of scholarly reading of Whitehead and so on. I don't think we're going to settle it here, but it's a really interesting question.
Yes.
We will organize another roundtable in 9 years, and we're going to celebrate process and reality.
That would be fantastic.
Dr. Richter, do you want to add anything to that, or anyone else?
No, I was just I was still thinking about the indifference question a little bit, because I'm also not sure what indifference, I mean, what is meant with indifference here. But if we might understand something like complexity, indifference in the sense of complexity, then I think there might be quite an interesting link here. So indifference is sort of as not yet differentiated. If we do that, then I think that there's something like that in Whitehead as well, in a sort of in the encounter between different events, and then we could talk about indifference as an interesting, as the location for the production of the new that is sort of left open and not located either, I mean, as I said before, in matter or in culture or somewhere else, but it's precisely indifferent. And that would not be the Badiouian indifference, but that might be an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. So if we think indifference as complexity, I think there might be a Whiteheadian way through that. And because I'm quite interested in systems theory, particularly Niklas Luhmann, I find that link with a sort of post-foundational systems theory quite interesting. And so I quite like that question. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's what was meant with indifference, or if that's just me.
Okay, very quickly, picking up on both what Hannah and Keith said. So when Keith talks about the atomicity in process and reality, that also, in Adventures and Ideas, Whitehead actually has quotes, "Am I my brother's keeper?" which is what Cain says to God when he's denying that he in fact did murder Abel. And Whitehead sort of gives that a positive twist as sort of the fact that contemporaneous events are actually independent of each other, even though they both may have roots in the same past. And this is something else for me. This also goes out to the question of the past and the future. It seems to me that Whitehead, when Whitehead says, I quoted Whitehead as saying that the future is real but not actual, but he doesn't say that about the past is already settled and nothing can take it up in various ways and nothing can be done about it. And that seems to be a different inflection from Bergson and Deleuze's interpretation of Bergson, where the virtual for Bergson and for Deleuze seems to be much more tied to the past. And Whitehead seems to try to separate potentiality from the storehouse of the past. I mean, my sense is that that's why there's 2 separate concepts of God in that weird part of process reality. One has to do with ontological memory, and the other has to do with the reservoir potentiality. And those, both Deleuze follows Bergson in combining those, and Whitehead seems to want to separate them. And I don't know where this leads, because I've been trying to think about this.
I'm afraid I should start moving on to the conclusion of the roundtable. Is there anything that any participant would like to conclude with? Any final statement or otherwise? So we hope that this conversation has steered and inspired some fruitful and forward-looking thinking. I'm glad to corroborate that Whitehead can still shed light on the forces and coalitions through which our world is, nowadays ongoingly reconfigured. On behalf of the Critical Humanities and International Politics Research Group and the School of Humanities from the University of Hertfordshire, I want to express once again our most sincere gratitude to the participants. Also, I want to thank the audience for sticking around during these 90 minutes. Let us just invite you to follow us on Twitter and to visit our website to be updated on our research outcomes and forthcoming events. So once again, many thanks, everyone. I hope we can meet again in a near future, hopefully in person. Yeah. So all the best to everyone, and thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.